The book with the interesting binding was a history of Damar. Erin had had to learn a certain amount of history as part of her royal education, but this stuff was something else again. The book was faded with age, and the style of lettering was strange to her, so she had to puzzle out some of the words, and some of the words were archaic and unfamiliar, so she had to puzzle out their meaning. But it was worth it, for this book told her stories more exciting than the ones she'd made up for herself before she fell asleep at night. And so, as she read, she first learned of the old dragons. There were still the old myths of the great dragons, huge scaled beasts many times larger than horses, and it was sometimes even said that the great dragons flew in the air with wings spread so vast as to blacken the sun. The book took the old dragons seriously. It said that while the only dragons humankind had seen in many years were little ones, there were still one or two of the great ones hiding in the hills, and that one day the one or two would fly out of their secret places and wreak havoc on man, for man would have forgotten how to deal with them. From the author's defensive tone, the great dragons ever in his day were a legend, a tale to tell on festival days, well lubricated with mead and wine. But she was fascinated, as he had been. Being born is a terribly complicated thing. You're brought into existence in a world with massive complexities and issues that are years, decades, centuries in the making, none of which you had any say in the matter, and are expected to grasp and eventually participate in these systems after a culturally designated amount of time. You are constantly dealing with the fallout of events that happened so long ago that everybody involved are now dead. I mean, just take the 30 years before I was born, just in the country I live in. I miss McCarthyism, the Civil Rights Movement, Bay of Pigs, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, John F. Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy, the Summer of Love, the Moon Landing, the Vietnam War, the Stonewall Riots, Watergate, 3 Mile Island, the Iran hostage crisis, and the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. Before I could vote and have an actual say in the matters of the world, I was a helpless observer for the end of the Cold War, the Challenger explosion, Operation Desert Storm, the LA riots, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Oklahoma City bombing, the Lewinsky scandal, Columbine, and 9/11. This is why we create myths. To simplify our path, streamline it into something digestible, make it seem like these things have some grand objective meaning and not just the result of complex and barely working systems. Pretty much everything you see in old Western movies has nothing to do with the actual history of the people living on the western side of the North American continent in the 19th century. We've constructed a myth of the Wild West that makes our past less complicated and more meaningful. And relatively speaking, that wasn't that long ago. Sometimes, if you go back far enough, these myths are the only things that exist. The actual history eroded away. There's appeal in that. Myth and legend are escapisms to a somewhat extreme degree. They tell you that people live lives of purpose, that there are objective moral truths, and individuals can be important. Hercules, Beowulf, King Arthur, heroic figures whose lives, while fraught with challenge, are outright simplistic when compared to the moral, emotional, and psychological complexities of a random Target cashier. Fantasy fiction taps into this appeal in some degree. Fantasy takes those things codified in myth, the magic, the creatures, the larger-than-life characters, and the general lack of indoor plumbing, and present a version completely removed from human history. I'm generalizing, of course, don't at me, urban fantasy. But since we tie fantasy fiction to our historical myths, there is, shall we say, a compulsion among certain readers to treat fantasy fiction as historical myth. We call it world building. All genres can have world building, the act of treating a fiction as real with a real history, but fantasy and its forward-looking sibling science fiction are usually what we think of when we think of fleshed out fictional environments for readers to explore. A well-defined setting with a rich history can be really cool to think about, to explore. But while I've enjoyed poring over the maps and lineage charts of the Lord of the Rings as much as the next geek, it's never rung completely true with me for this reason. If we're treating this as an actual history, where are all the myths? Using j.r.r. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as an example, we're given a ton of history, language, culture, and geography of Middle-earth through the fiction itself and through tons of reference material. And it's all presented as an objective truth about this world. Even Middle-earth's creation stories are true. Characters like Gandalf, Saruman, and Sauron are direct agents of the world's pantheon. There's little in the way of theological denomination, alternative mythologies for alternative cultures. There's a certain truthness to it all. Which was kind of the point for Tolkien. He was very interested in the creation of what he called secondary worlds, internally consistent settings. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from outside. It was imperative to Tolkien that everything in his creations be considered true, and that things untrue, things like inconsistencies and unknowns, had a negative impact on the reader. I'm not sure I agree, for two reasons. One, as fun as digging through Tolkien's secondary world is, pretending that a fiction has a certain objective existence ignores the role of the reader, which is to interpret the text from their own points of reference. We all have our own internal image of what the Shire looks like, how bloody and violent the conflicts actually are. We conduct the music backing the various songs and poems that litter The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien seemed to believe that the reader should be so convinced by his consistent setting that they should forget that they're reading at all, dismissing the reader's actual role as well as the external context of things like the author and time and place it was written. Two, as I've already addressed, real life, our actual objective reality, is full of things that are untrue. Our histories are hidden and mythologized, and there are things about the world that people do not agree on. For crying out loud, there's a small group of people who genuinely think the world is flat. They think that right now, in the 21st century. They're saying it on Twitter. We don't live with the certainties of Tolkien's Middle-earth, which may give it some escapist appeal. Things are much more straightforward there. But if anything, those certainties make it less real. Why are characters so certain of the history of the One Ring, what it can do, and how to destroy it? Because there's no alternative to believe in. There are no myths. What I find so interesting about Robin McKinley's 1-2 punch of 1982's The Blue Sword and 1984's The Hero and the Crown is that they directly engage with myth by first establishing and then dismantling a myth. The Blue Sword tells the story of Harry Crewe, an orphan girl traveling to the royal province of Daria. At least that's what the colonialist Homeland calls it. The actual native hill folk, dubbed the Outlanders, call their ancestral home Damar. The king of the Outlanders, Corlith, kidnaps Harry because of some fate magic in his bloodline, but Harry's cool with that because of the fate magic in her bloodline, so it's all okay. Harry takes to the Outlander society pretty well, and after a vision, decides to train to become a sword-wielding warrior. This vision is that of Lady Arryn, the Dragon Slayer, former Queen of Damar, wielder of the Blue Sword. But when Harry attempts to learn more about this figure, she finds herself finding scraps, a vague sense of legend over a hard history. One of the things Mathin would tell her little of was Arryn Dragonkiller and the Blue Sword. He would refer to Damar's golden age, when Arryn was queen, but he would not tell her when it was, or even what made it golden. She did learn that Arryn had had a husband named Tor, who had fought the Northerners, for the Northerners had been Damar's enemies since the beginning of time in the hills, and even Damarian age had its tale of conflict between them, and that King Tor was called the Just. "It sounds very dreary, being just when your wife kills dragons," said Harry, and while Mathin permitted himself a smile, he was not to be drawn. Eventually, Harry makes it as one of the king's riders and is gifted Gonturin, Arryn's blue sword of legend, making her the first woman to wield it in a very long time. Arryn remains a vague but important background figure as Harry rides to defend Damar from the demon armies of the north. She finds love and learns some things about her real heritage. It's some decent fantasy adventure, nothing all that groundbreaking except for the gender of the main protagonist. Now, if this story followed Tolkien's attitudes towards secondary worlds, then the legend of Arryn would be presented as an objective history. But then comes The Hero and the Crown, a prequel that tells the story of Arryn and how she became that legend. And it's not nearly as straightforward. Erin is the only child of Albeth, the king of Damar, her now gone mother rumored to be a witch that snared the king in an attempt to gain control of the throne. She is, otherwise, a fairly normal teenage girl, prone to doing stupid normal teenage things like eat some poisonous plants on a dare. This makes her weak and puts her on bed rest for months. To keep herself occupied, she finds an old book of history that tells of legends of the dragons, and at the very back, a recipe for a fireproof bomb. It's in an old style of writing, and there's no precise amounts given for the obscure ingredients, so Erin spends months trying to decode it and working out different mixtures until finally, she's rediscovered the secret substance, which is perfect for surviving dragon fire. The twist is that dragons aren't the giant, powerful beasts of legend, but tiny pest animals, no bigger than a dog, who occasionally come out of the woods to sift through trash and kill the odd bit of livestock. They are essentially fire-breathing raccoons, and with her newfound protection against fire, Erin becomes the dragon killer, by which we mean she's a really effective exterminator. Erin is pest control. Imagine if 500 years in our future we told tales of Orkin, the slayer of the mythical cockroaches, house-sized alien insects who hid in the dark crevices of reality. I give you the fabled light of Orkin, whose holy glare forced back the cockroach hordes. It is, at least for the first part of the book, a bait and switch. Our real-world idea of dragons informs how dragons should look and behave in fiction, and even the book Erin reads tells of the massive dragons of myth. But instead, the dragons are tiny vermin, and the fabled dragon killer is just a working girl who found an advantage in dealing with them through chemistry. It is the most utterly mundane way to tell a story about slaying dragons. While you can get surprised by that on its own, if you come into this having read The Blue Sword first, you're going to be that much more surprised. This is Erin the Dragon Slayer? Nothing in The Blue Sword indicated to the true nature of dragons, and in fact, people at that time may not even remember the existence of the small vermin lizards and just the giant kaiju of myth. Robin McKinley insists on reading the books in publication order for this reason. Also, there isn't anything I can do about this, but it makes me kinda nuts that the world keeps second guessing me. I wrote Sword first and Hero second because you're supposed to read them in that order. But because Hero is a prequel, lots of people, especially people in the marketing department of your friendly local publisher and library and bookstore list makers, think they're going to be clever and helpful and tell potential readers to read the books in order, i.e. Hero first. Wrong. One of the big things I'm trying to fool around with is the concept of the hero. Harry has to live with the idea of the 7 league boots Erin must have been perfect. Then you read about Erin and find out that it wasn't like that at all for her perspective. There are discussions online suggesting that the read order doesn't matter, or that it actually works better if you read Hero before you read Sword, but I think the intended experience is most valuable. Establishing a myth and then dismantling it. Sorta. I was rather disappointed when an actual dragon-sized dragon showed up midway through The Hero and the Crown. Perhaps the dragon was not so large as a mountain, but the heavy black cloud that hung around it made it larger than a mountain, and when it first caught sight of them, it lifted its wings briefly, and the sun disappeared, and a wind like a storm howled around them. Then it bowed its long neck to the ground, its nose pointed toward them, and its half-lidded eyes stared straight at them. With that, the story of Erin, the vermin control lady, actually becomes Erin Dragon Killer. The dragon fight is realistically messy, it's not a sexy action scene. Erin gets seriously hurt and is out of commission for weeks, but she actually slays an actual traditional dragon. So maybe the reading order doesn't matter that much. I must confess, the book failed to hold my interest after that. It's one interesting idea used up. In fact, this is the last time slaying dragons is even really a relevant thing in the story. Erin is led by an unseen force to a man named Luth, where she's given supernatural gifts and told to face off against an evil mage named Agsdead, a character not even hinted at for the first 2/3 of the book. It's like the book got bored with the interesting self-reliant stuff and went, whatever, here's a last-minute hero's journey. Self-governance gives way to fate, choosing a life you want to lead gets paved over with destiny. I couldn't have been more disappointed. But none of that devalues the initial idea, that idea of discarding myth for a messy, non-sexy reality. Sometimes one good idea is worth it. Outside of a few loose short stories, these are the only tales of the land of Damar that Robin McKinley wrote, and 30 plus years later, it doesn't seem like she'll ever be coming back to the setting. So I suggest taking it as such, not as a sprawling fantasy setting, not as world building, but as a singular work of world deconstruction. Myths are interesting, they're fun, they can be exciting, but they're not true. Truth are the everyday people trying to make this mess of a world work.